Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the first keynote speech today. Our first keynote speaker today is Professor Milton Muller. Professor Muller is currently teaching at the School of Public Policy, Georgia Institute of Technology. His research focuses on the political economy of the Internet, including property rights, institutions, and global governance in the information and communications industry. He is also one of the founders of the Internet Governance Project and has played a leading role in organizing and mobilizing civil society in ICANN and OECD. It is our great honor to invite Professor Muller to be one of our keynote speakers today. He is going to talk about why regulating social media is really about controlling the internet, which echoes the concern we have about the freedom of expression in the digital media era. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Muller.
Well, hello, everybody. And again, to echo Paul, I'm really sorry I can't be there. I want to thank Anthony for inviting me. He invited me last year, and of course the whole thing was canceled. And I was really looking forward to visiting Taipei this year, and of course that didn't happen, but I am visiting you remotely. And I'll try to make this as lively as possible. So let me share my screen and get my slides up. All right, so my topic is indeed free expression and its importance to democracy and the way internet and social media are affecting it. Let's begin about talking about social media in general. Social media and the internet expand our capacity for communication and social interaction. They allow people to mobilize, express opinions, exchange cultural artifacts, and share information at an unprecedented scale. They support transactions and payment systems. One of the largest specimens of current social media, YouTube, has 2.3 billion users, more than any nation state, and a presence in over 100 countries. Its video content covers 80 languages, and 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. Facebook, another big one, has 2.8 billion active users, and 1.8 billion of them visit the site daily. Now, some of the regulatory concerns about social media appear to be matters of economic policy. Network effects, economies of scale, and a business model based on advertising all contribute to the concentration of user populations into large platforms. People love to refer to platforms as monopolies, but this isn't quite correct. They are big, but they straddle multiple overlapping markets where none of them are anywhere near close to being the sole and exclusive supplier. Although there are tremendous advantages to scope and scale in these markets, there's a surprisingly large number of social media platforms. As the rise of TikTok in the United States demonstrates, new platforms can come into being and achieve critical mass quite rapidly if they innovate. The example of TikTok, which is Chinese, also demonstrates the importance of foreign capital and global market access in fostering competition and innovation. Now, at the present time, there's a powerful backlash against social media. Despite the economic issues I mentioned, most of this backlash is driven by issues related to content on social media. And this worries me, because I think it's also a backlash against the way information technology and global connectivity have eliminated traditional gatekeepers and controls over communication. In other words, it's in some ways a backlash against the internet itself. To begin to illustrate this, let me introduce you to somebody who's probably not one of your favorite people, or maybe he is. But this is probably a familiar story. the story of the Capitol Hill riots in the United States. Those riots lasted a couple of hours, but they had a lasting impact on public policy towards social media in my country. Our former president, as you know, refused to accept the fact that he lost the election. This wasn't just any election, by the way. The stakes seemed extremely high, and the electorate was very polarized. It sparked levels of voter turnout in the United States that had not been seen for more than 50 years. Now, Biden won the election with only 51.3% of the popular vote. And when Trump was declared the loser, of course, he told his political supporters that the election had been stolen. Legally, that lie never got anywhere. The courts didn't buy it. No election officials supported it or acted on it, even in Republican-run states. But Trump kept saying it nevertheless, building up anger and resentment among his hardcore followers. Now, Trump's doomed electoral challenge culminated in the events of January 6th. For the preceding month, Trump backers had been promoting a rally in Washington on that date because that was the day that Congress was supposed to certify the election results. When it was clear that attempts to challenge the electoral count in Congress would fail, Trump went before the crowd and encouraged them to fight. They then marched to the Capitol, and about 300 of them violently broke into the building, interrupting the certification process. In the wake of this attack, Trump and his acolytes were discredited. Trump himself was deplatformed, removed from Twitter and Facebook. In fact, Facebook and Twitter removed thousands of accounts associated with Trump and the right, or the extreme right. Later, and this is my crucial point, in hearings on social media regulation, members of the US Congress basically blamed Facebook, Twitter, and Google for the riots. They pointed out repeatedly that the rioters had used Facebook pages and other social media to connect with each other. They pointed out that Trump had used social media to spread his disinformation that the election had been stolen. Cable news and the New York Times and many other progressive media outlets echoed this theme. In short, social media was put on trial for the riots well before the actual rioters were. Now let me tell you a different story. On February 23rd, 2020, in my home state of Georgia, Ahmaud Marquez Arbery, a 25-year-old African-American man, was jogging down a street in Brunswick, Georgia. He was unarmed. Now, Brunswick is a small, fairly rural, mostly white town. And two men noticed him and kind of assumed that he was a criminal. So they grabbed their guns and chased him in their pickup truck. And when they caught up, they tried to arrest him in what they called a citizen's arrest. In the ensuing struggle, Arbery was shot 3 times and died in the street. Now, for more than a month, no one was arrested or prosecuted for this killing. No one. Indeed, one of the men who did it used to work for the Brunswick Police Department and knew the local district attorney. Law enforcement authorities recused themselves and passed the buck. Nothing happened until May 5th. And what happened on May 5th? Well, a video of the shooting was given to a local radio station, found its way onto YouTube and Twitter, and went viral. Within hours, the case got the attention of the state attorney general and the governor of Georgia. An investigation was started by law enforcement at the state level. The perpetrators were quickly arrested. All 3 of the white men involved are now on trial for murder. And months later, Georgia's citizens arrest law was changed in order to prevent incidents like this in the future. So these 2 stories make for an interesting contrast, don't they? Social media was put on trial for the January 6th riots, but its role in the Arbery incident was not called out. There have been no congressional investigations about how YouTube helped to expose injustice and produce legal reforms. There are no newspaper stories cheering on open social media for exposing and helping to rectify a racist incident. No one praised social media for its role in the George Floyd case either. Even though it was Twitter and YouTube images of his final minutes that sparked nationwide protests and the prosecution of the police officers involved. For that matter, no one made a big deal out of the role of free and open social media in Hong Kong's rebellion against domination by China's Communist Party. So there's a discrepancy here, and I'm calling your attention to it for a reason. It exposes a distortion in the way internet and social media are being portrayed in the current public discourse. And those distortions have important consequences for internet governance. I believe, and this is probably a controversial statement, I believe that social media is being attacked precisely because it is structurally the most democratic form of public communication that has ever existed. It made anyone a publisher. It allowed people holding the most diverse viewpoints, even crazy viewpoints, to find each other and coalesce. It eliminated gatekeepers. It made political borders almost irrelevant. And it's even starting to overcome many linguistic barriers. Social media made it possible for all kinds of people, good, bad, and ugly, to attract a following and attempt to monetize it or leverage it. Building on the internet connectivity that came before it, social media applications created more sophisticated forms of interaction, giving birth to a vast virtual society which is not entirely under the control of pre-existing power structures. This scared a lot of people. We are now in a period of reaction. Since 2016, we have seen a partisan, ideologically based attack on that new social capability. Surprisingly, people on the left, at least in the United States, are the ones who seem to be the most afraid. They believe that social media is responsible for the right-wing populism that Donald Trump exemplified. Although that assertion is uninformed, even ridiculous, they believe that social media caused Trump, that it caused the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, that it caused white nationalism, that it caused the Christchurch killer in New Zealand, that it is responsible for human rights violations in Myanmar. Not the government of Myanmar, which is doing most of the bad work, but social media. Indeed, we are told that social media is destroying democracy. It is flooding the world with disinformation and hate speech and making us helpless pawns of foreign powers interfering with our elections. This is the narrative that we're getting from the progressive left. Now, don't write me off as a cyber utopian. I know that bad things happen in this vast virtual society. It is, after all, a human society. Its inhabitants bring with it all the forms of abuse, crime, and conflict that existed before, and sometimes even new tools, new forms of abuse, like ransomware, computational propaganda, identity theft, and disinformation campaigns. Now, these are real problems, but I think their impact is being massively exaggerated, and I am actually optimistic about the way we can handle these problems, just as we have mitigated and handled other problems with the new capabilities of the internet. And we can do this without destroying the freedom and openness of the internet. The negative narrative about social media is fueling a worldwide crackdown on the capabilities of internet-enabled communication. Many of these crackdowns are enacted by dictatorships, but some of them are by democracies. Countries such as China have always viewed social media as dangerous, something to be carefully controlled. The negative narrative about social media is making those party dictators feel vindicated. We told you so, they said. You need to control this. In Brazil, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, the alleged pathologies of social media are justifying laws that are little more than traditional censorship regimes. Even when state censorship is not involved, and this is crucial, the companies that run the big platforms are getting the message loud and clear. The message is your job is to actively manage the nation's political discourse, and you shall do this in a way that actively suppresses any movement, any ideas that the ruling party finds threatening. And this is what convinces me that, whether they know it or not, the real target of the attack on social media is a general capacity to speak, mobilize, and organize without traditional forms of intermediation or hierarchical supervision. And that means the target is democracy and freedom of expression itself. Here's an example. Just last week, YouTube removed a recording of a routine policy discussion about the efficacy of putting masks on children. Two of the people in that discussion believed that you didn't need to put masks on children and they could go back to school without them. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. Why not discuss this? Why not have an open scientific discussion? The panel included health experts from Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard. These were not amateurs or crazy people. But Google removed this video. They claimed that the panel was misinformation. The company said it removed the video because, quote, it included content that contradicts the consensus of local and global health authorities regarding the efficacy of masks to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So they are pretending that there is a rigid and clear consensus about something that there is not. And this is inevitable when you ask them to moderate public discourse. Here's another even worse example. Tech reporters for the New York Times and The Guardian recently published articles targeting Telegram, WhatsApp, and Signal. You've probably heard of these. These are two-way messaging apps with end-to-end encryption. The reporters, who are liberals, progressives, you would think they'd be all for freedom of speech and democracy, but they were complaining about them, not because of the usual song and dance about advertisements and surveillance capitalism. No, the reporters were worried because these apps enabled private conversations to take place. And that was risky, they said, because people might be expressing thoughts and opinions that were socially unacceptable. Or they might be plotting insurrections like the Trump thing. Indeed, these private conversations could take place not only in pairs of people, but among hundreds of people. Unsupervised discussions among large groups. I kind of thought that's what democracy was about freedom of expression was about, with no possibility of content moderation by the corporation or the government. But these reporters found that to be a scary thought. The foundation of democracy is the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that people can govern themselves and that they delegate their powers of self-governance to the government, to the state, in order to collectively express that sovereignty. Freedom of expression is one of the pillars of self-governance. This has been known since the 18th century. Freedom of expression is more than just an individual right to entertain your own thoughts and opinions, to do your own thing. It's also a very practical tool for democratic self-governance. It's a means of keeping your government accountable and of seeking and finding the truth and of keeping the public informed. You cannot properly exercise the right to vote or hold public officials accountable unless you're free to investigate what they do. And you cannot be certain about anything, about any assertion about what's happening or what's true, unless you can debate it and discuss it and see it challenged in the open space. So separating the press and religion from the state was the first step we took centuries ago. And that, of course, is a logical corollary of liberal democracy. The state is a coercive monopoly, and while you need coercion to execute certain state functions, like arresting criminals, if the state can dictate or coerce thought and public opinion, you don't have a democracy. The people are no longer controlling the government is controlling the people. So how much of the criticism of human interactions on social media are just critiques of human freedom? We should know that in a democracy, some politicians are going to be demagogues, many will lie, some will be corrupt, some members of the population will choose to support bad policies and even advance destructive or discriminatory ideas. That's taken for granted. But liberal democracy is based on the idea that you can only solve those problems by protecting individual freedoms, by protecting freedom of association and democratic processes. An open and free media will expose the corruption, and the public will punish bad policies and bad politicians by voting them out of office or arresting them as criminals. And if you don't believe the public can do this, they can't be trusted to do this, you're not a Democrat. I don't know what you are. You could be a paternalist, you could be a communist, you could be a lot of things, but you are not a believer in democracy. Democracy does not mean that every citizen is an angel or that only correct ideas and good social movements will form. It simply means that social conflicts over policy and governance will be resolved through peaceful democratic means, by voting, by law, and that certain fundamental rights will be respected in the process, such as freedom of expression and privacy and the right to due process. And freedom of expression is an essential component of that, indeed the most important element of the public's capacity to peacefully deliberate over what is in the public good, over what is true and what is not. To impose greater controls on speech and association simply gives the forces who wish to manipulate public discourse more powerful tools with which to do so. This was a policy recommendation on this slide advanced in the United States. I think it's self-evidently ridiculous, but you can read it. Yes, what we need is a reality czar, somebody to tell us what is true and what is not, a government czar, which is a Russian term for Caesar. Where do they get these people? So let me conclude by saying that social media did not create the post-election crisis in America. A misguided political movement created it. Ultimately, the problem caused by Trump's big lie was resolved politically, as it should have been. Democratic institutions and processes held. Trump and his party were punished by voters. Trump not only lost the election, but the Republican Party lost its Senate majority. It lost control of Congress, due in no small part to Trump's attacks on the election's legitimacy in my own state of Georgia, which energized Democratic voters and encouraged them from participating and discouraged his own Republican voters from participating in the runoff elections. The Capitol riots discredited the president further. Democracy and free expression proved to be more resilient than we are giving it credit for. So the attack on social media embodies a set of normative and positive assumptions about the relationship between communications technology, behavior, and political authority that are not democratic and are not pro-internet freedom. Having identified those assumptions, we can see that they denigrate the vastly expanded capabilities of communication and information. They are saying that the internet is dangerous because it frees us from the monitoring and control of authorities. These arguments are fundamentally at odds with classical liberal ideas about free expression, freedom of association, and privacy. They are fundamentally at odds with notions of democracy, social welfare, and self-governance. Whether intentionally or not, they justify authoritarian supervision of all communication and all behavior. I will leave it at that. I look forward to any questions or comments you might have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Muller. Due to time constraint, we will not open the floor for questions at the moment. However, Professor Muller is going to join us at the high-level opening plenary later. So if you have any questions for Professor Muller, you're welcome to direct your questions later on at the high-level opening plenary.